only 4 of us, so I guess we must be Episcopalians. Sorry.
And I have to do my prostrations with this.
Yeah, in fact, you don't need to even do that.
I stretched my legs.
Oh, okay.
I'm like, as soon as it's gonna get for a while, I think.
All right.
Same as it was yesterday.
Thank you.
Do you like it on this side?
Makes no difference.
Okay.
Makes no difference when I'm using the iPad. I only need room on the left side if I'm writing.
Okay, that makes sense.
You're gonna have to sing louder. There's only 4.
No, I don't say louder. Lord Jongjen de Lo No Marba Mila Je Do Som Je Jai Kunjen Garma Je Je Jong Je Je Bai Je Na Zhang Zhong Ba Den Ro Ba So Za Lan Zha Zha La Na Nye Me Ro Gai Dam Bo Gai So Wa Zoi Gai Ju La Jumba Zeno Nam Da Jin Jalo Shaloi Gom Ji Gom Ba Song Ba Yenora Kun Lai Jai Zen Me Mano Se De Do Nai Je Be Gom Je Nyengor Shen Ba Me Ba Jin Jalo My God, Gom Je Go Zom Ba Je Me Na Der Go Je Me La John Do Zer Huai De Me Gom Je Je me ne veux je Ying me gom je son ba je Kong zara nom pe no wo zong ma de Ma zhe de gan zhong be gong je Gong zha lo dong zhong wan jin je lo Gong dong wan zhe gu zong ba shen Jiang ma yen jiang zhan wang la Ma ga rong ban zhan wei gong je Lam Chompa Zawa Jenje Lam Do Chompa Yeshe Jawa Jenje Lam Do Om Jen Yun Jen No Jong Zon Ma Ge Sara Dong Yan Zen Zhong Ge Pe Ma Zhong Ne Che So Ra Gora Do Bon Do Mo En Jen Je Zo Lo Jin Je Lam Je Je Zo Zo Nen Zhong Je Jin Bong Run Zhong La La Wang Je Gang La La Den Bai Je Zo Zhong Don Don Mong Om Ben Rango Zende Om Ben Rango Sa Bendra Samayanza Sarvasin Amalahum Harima Harenisa Ranzareya Zenda Rim Renza Gora Gandren Zon Jen Jen Doin Dram Bembo Nulang Goyen Jen Jen Ala Song Jen Jen Yelan Doin Jen Jen Wang Zhen Guo Jin Zhi Zhen Nam Ba Jin Lam Zhe Zhong Ba Jin Hui Zhen Dong Ba Jin Om Ben Rango Pema Dema Dage Kaya Abekinza Om Vanga Abekinza Sindambekenza Sarva Ambekenza Yesterday, we looked at the determination to be free, which, and I quoted His Holiness the 17th Dalai Karmapa as a source and reference, is basically true compassion for yourself. We talked about the 6 reasons, it's more like 6 inspirations. The reason we want to be free is because we want to be free deep down. But the inspirations are, first of all, Buddha nature, which I think has to come first, and I think that's why Lord Gampopa put it before his presentation of the precious human body and a permanence in the jewel ornament. Because we have to know it's possible. Society, parts of society tell us it's not possible. And sometimes we tell ourselves it's not possible. And then the second of the 3, the middle 4 of the 6, are the 4 thoughts that turn the mind. And we looked at those in a less gory way than is often done. Then finally, we looked at the inspiration of the 3 tools. Now, these topics are not coincidental. If you study Maitreya's higher continuum, Uttara Tantra, it's easier sometimes to use the Sanskrit because there are many translations with many different names. It's like Agatha Christie's books. They were released with one name and then they kept on changing the name, so you buy the same book. This is kind of an older person's reference, so you know, and you realize I've read this before, but it wasn't called this. It's kind of like that with translations of Buddhist texts, because every new translation, either because of copyright or because of whatever, has a new name for the same book. But in Maitreya's, of the 5 books of Maitreya, the most often quoted is the Uttara Tantra. Uttara means higher or supreme. It's really a comparative, I think, rather than a superlative, so I think higher is better. And Tantra in this case means something that is continuous. And so in it, he basically, it's sort of kind of the master treatise on Buddha nature. Therefore, Lord Gampopa said of our Kagyu tradition, he said, we have really 2 sources. The what do you call it, background text, or the I don't know what you call it, but the Japchut, you know, the Dharma that supports what you're doing. For Mahamudra is the Uttara Tantra. And the Japchut for the 6 dharmas of Naropa is the Hevajra Tantra. Anyway, that may not be germane, but in his teaching, Maitreya really connects the whole idea of the 3 jewels, Buddha nature, and all the related issues. So there are 7 chapters, which are called 7 Vajra points. Anyway, I urge everyone to read it if they like to read. If you don't like to read, then don't bother. We talked about the culmination of that inspiration to determination to be free. Having been inspired by the 3 jewels, the act of going for refuge, which is a ceremonial public action, at least once in our lives, and then becomes a daily action. And then that's also the transition into compassion because of one's relationship to the Sangha. So to develop compassion, we can start either with gratitude toward our mother, and then appreciation, finally empathy, love and compassion. Or if we are attuned that way, and some people are, we can start with empathy and then move from empathy to love and compassion. And only after we've begun to work with love and compassion can we properly practice the four immeasurables, because although love and compassion are among them, if we don't begin with impartiality, as Khenpo Naga says, and Longchenpa says, well, we may get into, it's easy to mistake them. And then we talked about the fruit or result of the four immeasurables, which is authentic bodhicitta. First, the aspiration, and then we talked a little bit about the implementation, I think. And now we have to look at bodhicitta itself. Aspiration bodhicitta is wanting to go somewhere. And implementation bodhicitta is actually making the journey, buying the tickets, making sure the car will work. We used to use the example of airplane tickets, but I guess we're starting to, but we're not quite there yet. So let's go back to automobiles. In 10 years, we'll be back to horse and carriage. So buying the hay, feeding the horses. Well, that's a real thing for some of us anyway, so we might as well. So in order to get somewhere, we have to actually make the effort, make the journey, which involves choices, making the right choices, as we now say to our children. And so the implementation of bodhicitta, which we're going to return to in a few minutes, involves the practice of the six perfections. But bodhicitta itself, and we need to remember this, and it's very hard for us as beginners. For example, Jomgulu Drutai, following the root text by I think Lama Yeshe Gyamtso, called the 7 Points of Mind Training. After he mentions the preliminaries, the second point, he starts with absolute bodhicitta before going into relative. And when I was a little slip of a thing and first encountered this extraordinary spiritual system, I thought, well, that's a little bit putting the cart before the horse. I don't even understand conceptually what you're talking about. And we need to know that it's not just about cranking up initially artificial, initially contrived, and eventually naturally discovered goodness. Nevertheless, I'm going to talk about relative bodhicitta and absolute bodhicitta from a couple of different points of view, because I think that it's like seeing stereo with two eyes. You get a better perspective. You can perceive depth. I don't perceive depth. I mean, I do roughly. I discovered when I had eye surgery as a 25-year-old that I don't have perfect stereo vision. It's not so visible, but one of my eyes is just enough off so that I don't perceive distance as well as most people, which explains my experience with baseball and hockey and football and other things as a kid. You know, the ball's there. It could be 30 feet away, it could be 3 inches away. It's like, I don't know, I have to judge by the size. One way to look at the relationship between relative bodhicitta and absolute bodhicitta is that relative bodhicitta is the aspiration and implementation. And those are collectively called relative because they are not an awakened mind. They're an awakening mind. Another way to look at it, however, which I think we need to keep in mind at the same time, and I know that's hard, but Buddhism always asks us to do that, is that they are the natural display of absolute bodhicitta. And the best way to think of that is they are healthy. They talk about this in the sutras where they say that when bodhicitta is developed under the influence of a preceptor or the scriptures, it's unstable. And then gradually it becomes stable. I think the stability is not only a matter of good habit, it's also a product of discovering something within. You know, we always talk about the Buddha within, Buddha nature. The Buddha within is not just wisdom, it's also the determination to be free and the determination to free others. So from that point of view, relative bodhicitta is both something we consciously develop through education. You know, we read about it in the books, we hear about it from our teachers, we take the bodhisattva vow. You know, we promise to do certain things and not do others, and we learn all these ways of fostering it. So in one sense, it is something, if not artificial, self-imposed. But as we impose that on ourselves, I think we begin to connect with something that is present internally. And that is the segue, I think, at least for us as ordinary people, between relative and absolute bodhicitta. Normally, or often, we think of absolute bodhicitta as perfect recognition of the mind's nature, an awakened mind as opposed to an awakening mind. But we also need to remember that in the sutras, it says that the bodhicitta of someone on the paths of accumulation and juncture, in other words, someone who's not an Arya Bodhisattva yet, their bodhicitta is relative bodhicitta. And once you cross that border through the path of seeing and achieve the first bhumi and enter the path of an Arya Bodhisattva, your bodhicitta becomes absolute bodhicitta. And if we look at it from that point of view, we can understand that there's less difference between the two. And that's kind of helpful because otherwise, you know, you read the 7 points of mind training, the Great Path of Awakening, and it says, okay, first it gives you these 3 ways to eradicate all fixation on reality, which you can't do, right? I mean, it's just too much. It's extremely profound, but it's either too little or too much. And then says, okay, do that sometimes. And now let's talk about taking the sending. And you know, oh, thank God, something I can imagine, something I can pretend, because all I'm used to doing is pretending. There's wisdom in that, because absolute bodhicitta is not pretending. Absolute bodhicitta is the real thing. Now, there's not that much more I can say about absolute bodhicitta, because I'm on the same page as everybody else. You know, it's like I'm struggling, forget about being familiar with it. I'm struggling to understand it. You know, Mahamudra instruction, Dzogchen instruction, my pathetic attempts to practice them, you know, the other practices we do, they're very helpful, but I'm not there. You know, I'm just not there. You're not supposed to talk about your degree of experience and realization, but I will. I don't have any. My experiences are of distraction, kleshas, gross levels of attachment, mood swings, depression. Those are my meditation experiences. My realization is very simple. I'm not realized. I realize that, you know. So here we go. So I think that, and this is one of the points that Jungwa Lodro Tai makes in his excellent short book, which I think it's one of the most precious things we have that's been translated, is that one should spend more time working on relative bodhicitta simply because if relative bodhicitta is stabilized, absolute bodhicitta will arise spontaneously. Whereas he says for beginners, and beginners, you know, it sounds like it means somebody who walks into a Dharma center today. It means anybody who has not yet achieved the path of seeing. For beginners, absolute bodhicitta is very difficult. And relative bodhicitta is also difficult, but it's not very difficult. You know, there's hard and then there's impossible. It's hard for me, it would be hard for me to run around this Kora path. That would be hard. It would be very hard for me to run 3 miles. That's the difference.
Lama Yeshe, on the book it says Jamgon Kongtrul. Is Jamgon Lodro Tai the same as Jamgon Kongtrul?
The Jamgon Kongtrul referred to is Jamgon Kongtrul the first. So yes, Jamgon Lodro Tai.
Oh, okay.
He had many names. In our long lineage prayer, we use all of them. His monastic name was Yimten Gyamtso, Ocean of Qualities. His bodhisattva name was Lodro Tai, and that's the name under which he is primarily predicted in the sutras by the Buddha. His Vajrayana secret name, which is no longer secret, was Pema Kachiwangchuk or Pema Gawang, and his name as a Terchen, was Tenyi Yungdrung Lingpatsal. A Tenyi can be interpreted, the two doctrines, as Sutra and Tantra or practice and study, but really it's because he was a Terchen of both Buddhism and Ben. He had Ben Terma. He was not a sectarian Buddhist. He had Ben Terma. And that's why the Yungdrung, which is a word we don't like because it's swastika, but it means perennial. That's a Bön symbol. So, and Lingpa means he was a Terchen, and Zal means he was powerful. Okay, so that's really everything I can say about absolute bodhicitta because I've never gone there. So now let's turn to the 6 perfections, which are the proper, they're not, I mean, you could say there's more to implementation bodhicitta than the 6 perfections, but they are the main body of it. the order of the six perfections is not random. So in a sense, they constitute a stages of the path and something that we can use. Now, what you have to understand when approaching the great and massive literature of the Mahayana, the sutras and sutra stories that get quoted, is that they're very dramatic. So when it talks about the perfection of generosity, it will talk about people giving their eyes away, giving their heads away, and giving their limbs away, and all kinds of stuff like that. Bardor Rinpoche was very, very clear in teaching here and in teaching this stuff at KTD, which he did, that's like, you're not supposed to start there. You know, it's like if you were somebody who had never exercised and were being taught an exercise program, and they showed you an exercise video of the world's greatest Olympic athletes doing their, you know, like, what's her name? Simone Biles or Biles? Biles. It's like Simone Biles basically flying like a bird, doing stuff that looks barely possible for a human being. I said, yeah, that's exercise. Now we're going to teach you exercise, you know. So you're allowed to start where you can start. In fact, when the practice of generosity is taught, if you have an issue with material generosity, they tell you to start by taking a penny or the equivalent, holding it in one hand, identifying that hand as you, holding up your other hand, thinking of that other hand as other, and passing it from that hand. And then transferring it, thinking of that hand as you, the other hand as other, and passing it back. Now it sounds ridiculous, but given the fact that most of us feel really comfortable walking by homeless people without even acknowledging their humanity, it may not be ridiculous. It may be something we need to practice. Generosity comes first because giving is something that is very natural to us. Not that we always do it, but there's a part of us, there's a part of all of us that wants to give. This is taken advantage of in our culture with all of these giving holidays that have been created by various industries. You know, there's the saying that Charles Dickens invented Christmas. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I know that it was a lot rowdier and raunchier before then. It wasn't about kids. You know, Hallmark invented Halloween, and you know whatnot. I mean, none of these things are absolutely true. But what gets taken advantage of in our culture is the fact that giving for us feels good. And because it feels good doesn't mean it's bad. Not everything that feels good is bad. It's like the saying, not everything that glisters is gold. Not everything that feels good is bad for you. Sometimes you'll eat food that is actually healthy for you, and it will feel good. Sometimes you need to sleep, and you can actually sleep. I slept last night. I mean, really slept for the first time in a while. And I woke up wanting to sleep more, but I do feel good. Okay. So generosity feels good to us, and that's healthy. And it feels good to us because we have Buddha nature. His Eminence Taisuttu Rinpoche, while teaching at KTD, and he is considered an emanation of Maitreya, who's sort of the poster boy for Buddha nature. I mean, because of his Uttara Tantra Shastra and so on. He was talking about Buddha nature, and he said, it's true what they say, the complete realization of Buddha nature is only achieved by Buddhas. Even Bodhisattvas don't completely see all of it. But he said, but what you have to understand is the experience of Buddha nature is something everyone has. Absolutely everyone. And he said, you have a word for this in English, touched. I was touched. He said this in English, I'm not, I was touched by such and such gesture. I was touched by what I saw. That's Buddha nature. That's part of it. It's not all of it. So when we are generous, if we do it without resentment, excuse me, we are touched. We benefit the recipient of generosity provided it is appropriate generosity. And we benefit ourselves because every time we do something that touches us, we create a little hole in the encasement that surrounds the heart of Buddha nature, so to speak. A little bit, another ray of light comes out, a tiny one. And we can always seal it back up. I've done that a million times, which is why we have to keep on doing it. There are three types of generosity to go classical on you. Material generosity, the giving of, four. Sometimes three, sometimes four. Let's say three. Material generosity, the giving of protection, and the giving of Dharma. Material generosity is obvious. Anytime you give any being, human, animal, fish, insect, anything that we can recognize as a being. I personally believe that bacteria are beings. I suspect that viruses may be beings. I'm growing convinced that at least some of what we call vegetables are beings, and I strongly suspect that fungi are, because they have like cities. So, but that's just me. Any being that you give something to that is good for them, that is material generosity. The giving of protection is protecting them from harm and death. So, I can't talk about this because I eat meat. I have no right to talk about this. It's the worst. It's not the worst, but it's one of the worst types of hypocrisy in the world when people who eat meat dare to talk about the giving of protection. I'm a murderer. I have frozen hamburgers in my freezer right now. They are the product of institutionalized murder. And I don't believe in orders of intelligence. I know that I can talk, and the dogs with whom I'm in contact cannot talk. But I also know they understand a hell of a lot of what I say. They get my mood. They know when I'm depressed, and they'll spend more time with me. And I know that they feel. I'm not willing to believe, and scientists get mad at me. They say, well, you just haven't studied science. I'm not willing to believe that wasps and ants and spiders don't have the same feelings that I do. I've told this story, not, well, translating or teaching, but about 4 or 5 years ago. I get a spider, seems to be always one, in my shower every summer. And it's that, I don't know what species they are. There are actually more species of spiders than there are like people in the world, I think. But you know, they're the ones that start out as little and yellow, and then as they get bigger, they start to turn brown, and they have a longer body compared to a round body spider. And so I have one in the shower, and they're usually pretty good at staying up so the rushing water doesn't hurt them. But either I was splashing too much, or the spider was getting too daring. It got hit by the current and was in danger of going down the drain. Now I have arachnophobia. I had nightmares about spiders throughout my childhood. I would strip my bed every night out of the paranoid fear that there would be spiders. But I reacted spontaneously. I picked the spider up and put them on one of those soap shelves and made sure that they were still alive, and then turned down the water so it wouldn't hit them again. So the spider stayed there for a few days, and then one day I came back from here, and I noticed that same spider, which I now recognize because it had grown into an adult, had moved to the center of my bed. It had never left the bathroom because the bathroom was the ideal environment. But I guess it had decided this person, this monster, I mean, we must be horrific monsters to them. They know they can't kill us. There's just too much. Had decided, this is my friend. This is my protector. And it was parked intentionally in the center of the made bed so that it was not camouflaged. It was not trying to conceal itself. It was there because by that point its yellow-brown color contrasted with my gray coverlet. At that point, I did put it outside carefully, but I realized there's a lot more to, So I don't believe in the notion that they're too small to have brains, or that you don't understand about the function of the nervous system. It's all autonomic and so on. Yeah. Anyway, so the protection of any being from illness, so that includes the practice of medicine, from starvation, which includes both the first and second types of generosity, and from any other danger, like, the flow of your shower and the drain. That's the giving of protection. The third type of generosity is the giving of Dharma. Now, a lot of people think this means preaching Buddhism. Actually, the Buddha forbade preaching Buddhism. You are not allowed to go knock on someone's door and say, have you heard of the Buddha? Here's a pamphlet about how great the Buddha was. We're not allowed to do that. We are allowed to answer questions, but only what is asked. So in other words, if someone comes up to me on the street when I'm dressed in my funny clothes, and says, what's that about? Then I'll say, I'm Buddhist. I won't say I'm a Buddhist Lama, because the Lamas are superior, and I'm not superior to anybody. But I'll say, I am a Buddhist, and what is Buddhism about? I will do my best to give the shortest possible answer. And then you don't go on. Because if you go on after that, you're not sharing Dharma. You're sharing your own egotistical investment in your own religion. People are not stupid. People understand that. People can clearly hear the difference between the benevolent wish to answer their question, because they have the right to have that question answered, and our egotistical wish to hook somebody into our cult. This is a cult. A cult is the worship of a specific deity or deities. We now use the word cult pejoratively to mean like Jim Jones and Kool-Aid and whatnot. But the difference is very, very subtle. And it depends upon the behavior, social responsibility, and good intentions of every person who at any point represents, especially visibly, that faith. So, for example, if someone were to come to me and say, should I also study, who were, to some extent involved here, should I also study with such and such teacher to whom I'm attracted, to whom I'm interested, who's doing such and such, maybe on Zoom? If I say no, I'm being a cult purveyor. We have to protect people from our own prejudices and our own ego. Every time you have the thought, I am a teacher, or even I am a teacher in training, wash your mouth out with soap. I'm serious. The Buddha was a teacher. We're always beginners, and we have to maintain that humility. Also, within generosity of Dharma is such easy activities as saying mantras to animals, whether dying, dead, or healthy. Here, we usually use the Dzogchen 6 syllables, a, sha, samaha, which are part of the Vajrasattva empowerment. And they're sometimes given in different order, but that's somehow the only one I remember. You don't necessarily, like sometimes you're driving and you see a raccoon or something that's been killed by the side of the road. You can just, say it under your breath. You don't have to open your window, with the aspiration that it benefit that animal. That is generosity of Dharma. Also, when you do, as Lama Trotop is going to be teaching the song and sur practices, you'll notice that there are parts of those, especially the sur, where you actually recite certain traditional stanzas, that are summaries of Dharma, like, do no wrong whatsoever, do as much good as you can, tame your mind. That is what the Buddha taught. So that's generosity of Dharma. Because you've attracted beings who are there by listening, and they can get benefited by it. So those are the three types of generosity. And now we get to Sutram or Shila. It's a very interesting concept. Tsul means manners, behaving properly, having good manners. Trim means rules, having rules about what you do. Like many Tibetan translations of Sanskrit words, these are an attempt to not just translate the obvious meaning, but to get to the connotations and associations that native speakers of Sanskrit would have with those words. And Tibetan translators took advantage of the fact that Tibetan being monosyllabic, you can double up. You know, like Buddha has the main connotation of awakened, but it kind of has a connotation, main meaning of awakened, but it has a connotation of perfectly bloomed and perfected, and also completely clean. So instead of translating it, and Gampopa points this out in the Jewel Ornament of Liberation, he translates it as Sepa, awakened, but then he says, but we use the terms Sang and Je to bring out the aspects of the process. So in the same way, Shila, which apparently, I mean, now it's just used as rules, but has a connotation of cooling down. And so it's translated as Tsul and Trim, Sutram. From the Mahayana point of view, there are three aspects to Shila, to discipline. These are the abstention from all that is harmful to others, the engagement in all that is beneficial to others, and the amassing of virtuous, I hate that word virtuous, the amassing of, sometimes they say Buddha dharmas, which in this case means the qualities of Buddhahood. Abstention from all that is harmful to others is something that we really all know what it is. And we do our best, hopefully. None of us is perfect. At some point, we will snap at one another. At some point, we will lose patience. On an egregious level, we may have killed, lied, cheated in relationships, stolen, gotten drunk and behaved inappropriately. That I've done. And gossiped, been unkind when we could have been kind. I mean, we know this is not, I mean, we were taught this stuff in grade school, I hope. So we don't need to hit ourselves or others over the head with the rules. We know what we're not supposed to do. And we do our best, and sometimes we fail. The moral discipline of benefiting others is to gauge your ability, gauge the need, and be realistic. Don't do something that is beyond your ability. There's a saying that holy individuals or authentic, it's a funny word, the sat, because it can mean genuine or true, but it can also mean holy. But holy individuals make few promises, but always fulfill them. We have a tendency, well, I have a tendency, I can't say this about anybody else, to promise the moon and not even deliver a star. Because I get excited, when we'll come back to this when we get to the perfection of diligence, I get excited by the idea of giving someone everything they want. But then, once the excitement of the idea wears out and the exhaustive reality becomes foremost, all of a sudden I have to retract it. So that is not the moral discipline of benefiting sentient beings. And then the moral discipline of amassing virtuous dharmas, as they call it, is simply study and practicing. That's where practice is actually an aspect of a moral discipline, especially when you get to samaya. When you get to samaya, then the practice you do is also keeping samaya. Okay. And then we'll talk about patience a bit, and then I'd like to solicit questions, because I've attempted to introduce a certain amount of controversy. Apparently, everybody has a brand. If you teach, you're supposed to have a brand, and so there's supposed to be a little bit of a kind of a in my brand. There's supposed to be a sting somewhere. So, patience. Patience is first of all, well, there's patience with harm inflicted by others. Excuse me. Patience with difficulty of practicing Dharma. And there's patience with the inconceivability of the truth. Now, I always find this list incomplete, because a lot of the stuff that makes me go ballistic being the opposite of patient, is not inflicted by others. I don't like the extreme heat. Well, one could argue that is, I guess, yeah. When I was a kid, I remember a lot of my anger was directed at inanimate objects. Some of it was directed at people, usually my mother, but inanimate objects used to bother me. And I still get very, very angry. I mean, we can call it frustrated or resentful, but it's anger, let's face it. I get very, very angry when things don't work. As technology becomes more and more complex, in some ways more and more convenient, in other ways more and more demanding. Like when I remember when I first had to move from the KTD healthcare insurance system to Obamacare, which is what I'm on now. There was nobody I was angry at. Nobody was making it difficult for me. There was no bureaucrat intentionally trying to make this, agony for me. But the fact that I could not figure it out, how to do it right, I had trouble doing it. I wouldn't say I was angry at my tablet. I wouldn't say I was angry at the internet. I suppose part of my anger was embarrassment that I wasn't even 60 then. So I didn't consider myself of an age where frustration with modern technology is a legitimate excuse. But and I remember I was, yelling and shouting at people around me, and I wasn't angry at the people around me. It wasn't their fault. But I was really mad, really, really out of control. I didn't smash anything or break anything, and eventually, I had to go back to the Stone Age and talk to people on the phone. And they walked me through it so far. So I think that in this first category, perhaps we should include not just harm inflicted by others, but also harm that comes from the inanimate world. And it's in this connection that I think a quotation from Shantideva in his chapter on patience, and a quotation from His Holiness the Jawan Karmapa in a talk he gave at KTD in 2011, have both proven helpful to me, so I'll share them with you. Yes, I do need to see what time it is, because I'm so impatient that when I'm talking about patience, I can go on forever. Shantideva proposes a situation. Another person hits you with a stick. And so somebody hits me with a stick. I get angry at the person who hit me with the stick. How many people here would get angry if someone hit you with a stick? Okay.
It would depend on who it was.
Yeah. So I guess Shantideva's assumption is that most of us would get angry if somebody hit us with a stick. He says that is an example of failure to understand the situation. Now, you need to know that Shantideva, as a great prasangika, which means argument by consequence, philosopher, was given to showing that false ideas are ridiculous. Prasangika reasoning is often, if you can get through it, actually very funny. So Shantideva says, okay, if you're angry at the person, it was the stick that hit you, not the person. Why are you not angry at the stick rather than the person? And you say he's great at, he'll pursue a whole argument. And you say, because the stick is an inanimate object with no self-control. The stick hit me because the person who has control moved it in a certain way. They held it, they moved their arm or in a certain way so that the stick hit me. The stick had no control over the situation. That's why I'm not angry at the stick. Well, Shantideva says, then you shouldn't be angry at the person because they had no control over the situation. The person hit you because they were overpowered by their anger. The person had no more authentic agency. And he introduces, obviously in different languages, but he introduces the concept of authentic agency versus apparent agency. His anger had authentic agency. Why? Because his anger controlled his action, which controlled the movement of the stick. So he said, if you're going to be angry at the proximate or immediate cause of your pain, then it's fine to be angry at the stick. That makes sense. Or if you're going to be angry at the authentic agent, the entity, whether sentient or not, that had authentic agency over the situation, then get angry at the person's anger. But don't get angry at the middleman. His agency was only apparent. Then the other thing, I found that very, very helpful. And then Shantideva also goes on about maybe blame yourself for existing and so on, but that's something that doesn't work well here. His Holiness, the Jawan Karmapa, visited KTD in 2011 and gave several talks in a large tent that had been set up there. And, I interpreted, I did my best. I was going through, I'm always going through something, aren't I? I was really going through something. And so I was kind of like a functioning zombie. I could go in, come out and stuff, but I didn't remember that much. Fortunately, my daughter, Claire, was there. And like many children in primary school, she had developed a good ear for practical solutions to interpersonal conflict. A better ear than I did. And she repeated something to me that he said that she claimed really, really helped her, was advice that really helped her. And it's slightly different from the way Shantideva does it, but it's much simpler and so maybe more immediately applicable. She said, when you think you're angry at someone, you're not. You're angry at what they did. And I found that helpful because I experienced conflict where someone whom I care about will do something that I find abhorrent. And not only am I angry, but I'm conflicted because I still care about that person. And so it's this sort of cognitive dissonance situation where I can't, I've got two things happening at the same time and it makes it worse. But what His Holiness said, the Karmapa said, for me helps. I'm not angry at the person. I'm angry at or about what they did. So that's the first of the three types of patience. Patience with the actions of others, and and I would include things in the inanimate world. Now, usually they call it Jiminyampe, Nupala Jiminyampe Zopa, which means thinking nothing of harm, like not making a big deal of it. The second type of patience is being patient with the difficulty of practicing Dharma. As His Eminence Sutta Rinpoche famously said at KTD, Dharma is not fun. It does not make us happy immediately. It is not an analgesic. It is not OxyContin. It isn't even alcohol. It doesn't take the pain away. It takes the cause of pain away, but very gradually. And it takes years to do that. Obviously, in the very beginning, we feel this sort of pink cloud of expression, the pink cloud of everything's going to be okay now because I've taken refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. I took refuge at the age of 19, having explored Dharma with some, looking, sniffing, coming back, sniffing since I was 16 or 17. And I took refuge, and immediately my mother developed cancer and died over the next 2 years, and I had to take care of her, move her from hospitals, and then they'd kick her out of the hospital, and she'd have to go to a long-term facility, and then they'd kick her out of that, and then I had to get her apartment. She couldn't move into the apartment because she, couldn't function. She couldn't control her bowels. She couldn't see. She couldn't, I couldn't get her books for the blind because I went to the office and I spoke the wrong language, and that was a no-no in those days in this city where I grew up. So, I had a terrible time. And my life fell apart. I struggled to practice. I quit university. I ended up building and then doing 1 3-year retreat, which I experienced as a type of hell. And then I came out and I said, I'll never do that again. And after 1 week outside, I said, I'll be doing another one of those. And so I did 2. And I think of them as the first one was the hot hell and the second one was the cold hell. And then I came out of 3-year retreat and my life fell apart again. I had no idea what to do with my life. I ended up becoming an interpreter, which I had no intention of being, and so on and blah, 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 blah. I've not had a lot of fun. I'm not blaming Buddhism, but I am willing at the age of 62, where there's probably not much time to have fun left, to accept that this is not fun. It's bloody hard work. It doesn't pay unless you're really corrupt. If you're really corrupt, probably somebody somewhere is getting rich off of this shit, but unless you're really corrupt, you're going to be poor. It's not respected. It's not trendy anymore. There was a period where Tibetan Buddhism was trendy. Now with all the scandals, it's not even trendy anymore. So doing this and being visible at doing this, people will sneer at you. I've been openly sneered at in New York City and in other places Forget about it. I'm not talking about bed stains. I'm talking about New York City. It's not cool. You're not going to gain any brownie points in your society for being Buddhist. The only way you'll get brownie points is if someone says, hey, have you met the Dalai Lama? So it's hard, and I think it's always been hard, because the Buddha went against the grain. He created a society that ignored the caste system. Now, this was India long before the entrance of Islam. So basically everybody followed the caste system. And he created this group that didn't. And we're still doing that. We're still doing that. And we get no excuses for doing that. It's not like because we're Buddhist, we get to ignore political correctness. We still have to be aware of that. If we're white Buddhists, we are now called upon universally to acknowledge our whiteness, white privilege, and all of that. If we're male, we are called upon legitimately to examine our sexism. So it's not like that because we practice a traditional religion, we get away with ignoring modern concerns. Being us is being in between a rock and a hard place, and they're always moving closer. Plus, it's hard work, it takes time, it costs money. So that's patience, putting up with the austerity or difficulty of practicing Dharma. And then to conclude, we don't understand it. It's inconceivable. We don't understand it. What we practice here, specifically, is Dzogchen. I don't understand Dzogchen. I don't understand any of this. I've heard things. I can repeat what I've heard, which is what I do when I'm teaching, not as well as when I'm translating, obviously. I'm repeating what I've heard. But if I were to say to any of you that I understand Buddhism, I really get it, I would be lying. And I have to, after practicing for almost 50 years, practically 10 of those years in retreat, I have to accept that. Okay, shall we dedicate the merit? Sonam de ye dam je ze kanye kone ye be no am je ne je ga na je ba la jo ba ye kim ben zo le ro jo Gewa de ye che wo Sanam Yeshe Gyamtso Sanam Yeshe Tumba Gwenye no Majo Changzhou Zen Neren Sache Manon Jenjo Chema Nyampa Mebado Gong Gondo Bawajo Semche Dangje De Danjo Nyanro Damje Dondo Dongmajo Jangjo Zamba Gondo Zejoba Yanda Ganje Malan Ramajo Songje Renje Zede Lambegar Jargon De Chadolon Paya Zamje Mejong Rebe Zangaj Seje Jodar Jambe Thank you.